Surge of activity for Democrats running for president. And that's not based solely on candidates hitting MSNBC tonight, with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand facing voters in a Michigan town hall with our own Chris Hayes, and Cory Booker appearing in Iowa to take questions from Chris Matthews. Those are certainly high-profile appearances in our neighborhood, yes. But then there's also Senator Elizabeth Warren campaigning at a Mississippi town hall that will be televised by another network, and a new candidate on the scene taking the lead in the fundraising primary, Beto O'Rourke, raising $6 million in his first day on the trail. As you may have heard by now, that's more than everyone, which is reshuffling early ideas about who the frontrunner may be, as Joe Biden keeps popping up with signs that he wants to be wanted. That's not a song reference. That's just how he feels, and makes a claim that may, according to some, be hard to back up.
I'm told I get criticized by the new left. I have the most progressive record of anybody running for the if anybody who would run.
The most progressive. Well, as we dig into what we think looks like perhaps the biggest 2020 campaign week yet, let's do it beat style with some facts and evidence. If this race is going to be ideological, as Biden and Sanders have somewhat been arguing, how do the candidates' records stack up? Note that Senator Sanders is saying any liberals in this race are effectively following him.
Virtually all of the ideas that we campaigned on are now supported by a majority of the American people and an overwhelming majority of Democrats and independents.
So if we take the Democratic presidential field, you've got candidates now who sound like Bernie Sanders. So why do you need to run?
Well, maybe the more appropriate question is, why do they need to run?
Why does anyone need to run? Everyone's welcome to run. It is still a democracy. Now, this debate is obviously just getting started. Sanders points to economic issues, where it is certainly true he's been out front. But we want to begin tonight with this. The wider picture is a lot more complicated. On choice and women's health, there's actually broad agreement. Every member of Congress right now running for president in the Democratic Party has a matching, equal, 100% rating from Planned Parenthood this year. Same on the environment, 100% ratings for most, and a close 94 for Beto O'Rourke. Then there are the issues of human rights and civil liberties, which have become so vital during a Trump administration with its policies on immigration and free speech and a lot of other liberties. And here the congressional Democrats all dip a little bit together. Scores in the 80s from the ACLU, Amy Klobuchar coming in below around 64%. Or take guns, an issue that often turns on which state people are from and which everyone's been thinking about in these last horrific days. Senator Sanders has moved towards gun control. And tonight, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand making some news, saying that she owns her move towards gun control, going from being a Democrat with an NRA A rating to an F.
Now, on guns, I should have done more. I regret, actually, not caring about other communities. My community didn't have the gun violence that other parts of the state had. And in fact, the biggest issue for upstate New York was hunting rights. And, you know, my mother didn't just cook the Thanksgiving turkey, she shot the Thanksgiving turkey. So I came from a different lens. But what I regret is that I should have cared more about ending gun violence in other places. And so the first thing I did when I became a senator was met with families who lost their loved ones to gun violence. And when you meet a mother or father who has lost a child to gun violence, there is no way you will ever not answer them directly and say, I will do something to end gun violence. And that's what I did.
Her argument there being the answer starts with listening, sometimes listening to voters and constituents. So take it all together. If you grade this pre-primary stage by money, Sanders and Beto are in the lead. If you rate it by Joe Biden's new ideology frame, a lot of candidates have claims to being the most liberal, from Warren to Harris to Booker. And if you rate it by who's doing the best with the voters, spoiler, I can't tell you the answer because it's too early to tell, so we won't try to. I'm joined now by our power panel right here in Washington, D.C. Eleanor Cliff, Washington correspondent for The Daily Beast. Juanita Tolliver, campaign director for the Center for American Progress. And Heidi Prisbilla, NBC's national political correspondent. Good to see all of you.
Thanks for having us, Ari.
What jumps out to you on policy?
Joe Biden is saying he has the most progressive record. The key word there is record. He's looking back on a career of 30 years in the Senate, and his involvement in the White House, and saying that he actually got things done. He was a key player on guns in the 90s with the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban. He has called the Violence Against Women Act his greatest legislative achievement. He works with anybody. He was good friends with Strom Thurmond when Thurmond was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. It was Biden who delivered the eulogy at Thurmond's funeral. He knows how government works. Democratic government is the art of the possible.
So you're making the distinction that he is talking about the most progressive results, not the most progressive person.
Yes, exactly. I think he's clearly not the most progressive person in the field if you're going to define that by, who's for every aspect of the Green New Deal or who's going to call themselves a democratic socialist. Obviously, he's not in that category, but he does have a record of performance, and he would know how to be president. And he's got to demonstrate that he can beat Trump. That, I think, is still the most defining characteristic that the Democratic voters want.
So on that, before we turn to some of the other features here, take a listen to what we've heard from several of these candidates on the economic populist front. I don't think Delaware, the home of where corporations incorporate for a reason, gives you that mantle. But we're hearing this again from multiple candidates, not just Senator Sanders, but economic populists like Warren. Take a look.
I am a capitalist. Come on. I believe in markets. What I don't believe in is theft.
I support capitalism. It in theory is something that requires competition that will allow us to be better and evolve.
That's what democratic socialism means to me.
They're not running away 100% from this socialism label like you saw with Bernie Sanders, because a lot of the ideas that they're running on, like Medicare for All, which all of these candidates, which you just showed, support, aren't seen as socialism by Democratic voters. And do you view Social Security as socialism? Do you view Medicare as socialism? So I think that the Democrats are wise in not taking that bait. And so you're not seeing them having this, kind of gag automatic reaction to that label. But at the same time, I think it was Joe Scarborough who on this network tried to trap Hickenlooper on the question about capital. Are you a capitalist? Yep. At the same time, don't reject that label either, because no system is pure.
Who knew that was a trap? I mean, the Democratic Party of the 1980s and 90s that was burning their ACLU card and embracing, DLC economic capitalism wouldn't know that you'd ever be denying that.
Right. Right. Well, now I think the real test for the Democrats is going to be how they distinguish themselves on policy, because they are pretty much all in the same buckets here on running. I mean, Bernie's right. They're running towards a lot of the issues that he embraced, like Medicare for All, not free college education, but a green energy plan, Medicare for All. And you're seeing, like with these candidates like Beto, who have a lot of the sizzle, they're not really there yet on the policy in terms of how they're going to distinguish themselves.
I want to get into some of the big distinctions that are already emerging in the field. Before we do that, we do have to check the box on the money, because the money matters even if it shouldn't. So a lot of folks look at this system and say, gosh, money in politics is a big problem. But we hear over and over from Democrats they don't want to unilaterally disarm. They want to go up against Trump. They want someone who can play in every way, from Twitter to the bank account. Yeah. So walk us through, because I know you've been looking at this for us here at NBC. What's going on with the money race right now?
Right. Well, Beto came in with this earth-shattering number, this number that was higher than even Bernie Sanders earned, and that earned him kind of the front-runner label. But I think the key distinction here is, where did that come from exactly? It's getting a lot of hype right now that, wow, he really exceeded expectations here, and that means he's in this game for the long run. And he is. That means more staff, more advertising, more buzz. But at the end of the day, how far is that going to get him if it's just a handful of donors and it's not really indicative of this groundswell of grassroots support that you're seeing, for example, with Bernie Sanders, who has a lot of small donors?
Well, and Barack Obama had a lot of small donors, and so it often depends on how people feel about the candidates. I mean, this is pretty remarkable, the comparison here, NBC News, 6 million on day one for Beto. Obama, in the entire first quarter, had 26 million. 3 months. And during that time, of course, there were many other distinctions about Barack Obama.
It is a massive amount of money, and I am not poo-pooing that. But at the same time, I think that just like we rushed maybe a little bit too much collectively as the media to say that he had a horrible rollout, we can't say yet exactly what this is indicative of until we see more data, more numbers. Ari, just a week ago, he was down by half in the polls, in the Des Moines Register poll in Iowa, that he had, because of his tour, his kind of soul-finding, dental visits, cross-country tour, had kind of put him back on his heels. So I think we still need to acknowledge that this is a massive sum of money, but we also need to find out where.
Well, you mentioned the dental visits, Eleanor. I think some of that was unfair. Who can forget Teddy Roosevelt's famous cavity live IG? I mean, everyone remembers that.
Right.
Really turned the Bull Moose party around when you saw the plaque in the molars. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Too much information. And,
TMI.
Yes, definitely. And I think that O'Rourke has a different way of campaigning. He has not hired a bunch of consultants, and for the last 40 years. Campaigns have been run on the backs of all of these consultants. And I like the fact that he's trying to find his own way. He's doing it a little bit too much in public, so he gets the he gets the rap of being too airy-fairy or.
Look, Eleanor and I are huge Dave Chappelle fans. I think that's well
Absolutely.
known. I was honored when he came on the beat. He's famously talked about when keeping it real goes wrong.
Oh, my goodness.
And that can happen in many different ways,
Right.
I think for Beto that's happened in a couple ways, and the people who are sympathetic to him say, but this is the thing. It's more raw, and it's more real, and it's coming out as he thinks it through. And other people say, we want more from a president. For your analysis, because I know you've been looking at this, we have some of those moments stacked together. Take a look.
I just got a call from my wife, Amy, who's back in El Paso, Texas, where she is raising, sometimes with my help, Ulysses, who's 12 years old, Molly, who's 10, and their little brother, Henry, who is 8 years old.
Recently, you drew some criticism for a remark you made about sometimes helping to raise your kids.
It's absolutely valid criticism, but I'll be much more thoughtful going forward in the way that I talk about our marriage and also the way in which I acknowledge the truth of the criticism that I have enjoyed white privilege.
Way to name it, right? Like, he's hearing the criticism and he's having a positive response to it because it is true. If you want to celebrate the fact that your wife takes on a larger share of parenting your children than you do, then celebrate her and the work and energy that goes into it. Don't say, well, I sometimes pop in kind of flippantly. And also recognizing his white privilege. In the Vanity Fair article, when he's like, I'm born to be in this, what other candidate could say that and keep us and still be taken seriously? I think to Ellen's point, like, he is going on the fly here, and it's not being received well, because my reaction as a woman, knowing what the women candidates are likely up against, knowing that the coverage is not nearly as forgiving, he's being given multiple chances here that people of color and women are not typically afforded. And so I'm looking for him to clean up his act, be more thoughtful about his language, and really find more constructive ways to discuss his privilege and more constructive ways to celebrate his wife, if that's his goal.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I think it also goes to the sort of, we just talked about the money primary, we talked about the ideology primary. There's also the invisible primary of what makes for someone who can credibly run for president in the eyes of whoever the establishment are, and I think everyone at this table plays some role in that, however responsibly we try.
What is the moment that is going to reveal them in a way that is memorable?
And does being unemployed and having come close in a race, is that enough for a young woman candidate, according to the establishment or not? That contrast, and I want also for your analysis to play in the same token the Trump test that Seth Meyers did. This is a joke, but it's like a serious joke because it goes to something where there's so much concern about Donald Trump's conduct, and yet if that becomes a sort of biased or reflexive attack on Donald Trump and isn't applied to anyone else, that's not necessarily positive for democracy or, by the way, journalism. No. So Seth Meyers makes this joke for all of you, but starting with Juanita, take a look at the point here.
All right.
Now, in the run-up to 2020, we here at Late Night, we're going to try really hard, and we're going to ask ourselves, would we make fun of Donald Trump if he said that? So let's see. Because every word was pulled out of me, like by some greater force, which was just the people there. Everything that I said, I was like watching myself, being like, how am I saying this stuff? Where is it coming from? Yeah, no, Beto, that was weird. Yeah. That was a weird thing to say.
No.
Seth Meyers got it right. We would definitely make fun of Donald Trump for saying that. And a lot of things that Beto has said fall into that category right now, unfortunately. I think on the flip side of that, as he's figuring this out and really living through his privilege of the ability to do that, again, he's got to clean it up and really get hard on facts, hard on policies, just like female candidates would.
Yep, I think we're already making fun of him, right?
Well, Seth Meyers was making fun of him. I'm just playing it.
We're reacting to Seth. But I've seen a number of other cuts like that. But I think, to your point, yeah, he's got to get a little bit more specific about what the policy is. And I think that also we're going to watch. It's not just this one data point of the money. Again, huge amount. But let's see what kind of crowds he draws. Let's see what he does in the polling if he's able to recover from that halving that he saw in the Des Moines Register poll.
Maureen Dowd and Gil Collins in the New York Times did very snarky columns takedown. And he reminds me a bit Gary Hart back in 1984, I guess it was.
Where's the beef? Where's the beef?
Exactly. And Gary Hart also had, then when he subsequently ran, he went out to the Colorado, out in the mountains somewhere, and had this sort of very navel-gazing announcement that everybody made fun of. But Gary Hart was really substantial.
This was generational, that Gary Hart was a sort of a new age, post-hippie intellectual.
Right.
And Beto is being cast as, and again, we're still learning, we'll see how it goes.
Right.
He's initially being cast as sort of a searching millennial.
Right, and we don't know if there's anything really down there that he's found. So I think that's what we're looking for. Yeah. I didn't mean that exactly like how it came out. I mean,
it's factual because none of the female candidates could possibly come out here with no hard, concrete policy proposals, with no hard facts that they're really taking to drive their campaign. He's like, I'm born to be in it, but doesn't have a clear message, doesn't have a clear message.
I have to fit in a break real quick. It's the cross between Born to Run and Not All Who Wander Are Lost. That's where I land.
Wonderful.
But
that's straight out of the Old Testament.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.